Today we are taking a deep dive into Y-DNA using a genealogical problem that I've had in my tree for a very long time. I decided it was time to bring this to the genetic genealogy expert, Diahan Southard. Now, she took a look at my cousin's Y-DNA and helped educate me further on the problem that I have been working on for years. Of course, you don't use Y-DNA alone. We talked a lot about autosomal DNA. This is the type of DNA that you would find over at Ancestry as well. And we compared the Y-DNA with that autosomal DNA. So she's going to dig into all of that here in a minute. But I tell you, this is a good one. If you want to learn more about DNA, watch this episode and watch it all the way through. Also, Diahan talks about her DNA workshops at the end of this video. Once you watch this episode, I think you'll realize this girl knows her stuff. I need to be taking her workshop, so I know I will. Wow, this one blew me away, so I can't wait for you to check it out. Hey, but if this is your first time here, my name is Connie Knox. I am a lifelong genealogist here to help you go further faster and factually with your family history research. Please make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so that you get notified each time I upload a video. You should also know that Genealogy TV has a website, a newsletter, and a Facebook page. You'll find links for all of that, as well as information about Diahan's workshops in the description box below the video on the YouTube channel. All right, we're going to jump into that interview right now. I do appreciate you coming on the show and help me figure out this Y-DNA thing. It's really kind of a combination of Y-DNA and autosomal DNA. So welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like it always is a combination of things. And it's great already that we know that in advance. So yeah, let's dive in.
Well, and traditional genealogy, because I think part of what we're going to talk about is some of the records that I found as well. So let me share my screen and show you what the problem is. All right, so the problem here is, and I've talked about this on the channel before. Henry Gustav Henley is my great-grandfather. And while I have Joel Davis Jr. plugged in as a father, I really don't know that he's the father. I have asked a DNA cousin who is a first cousin to my father. My father's has since passed away, so he couldn't take the test. But a first cousin to him took a Y-DNA test because it goes up the paternal line. And so what we're hoping to figure out is really some sense of which of the many brothers, so this couple here, Joel Davis and Panaya Newby, had 5 sons. So one of those sons, technically, to the best of my knowledge, should be the father of Henry, or Gus, as we call him. So Gus here, I suspect that he probably knew who his father was based on some of the records and things that I found, but I don't know that for sure. And Rebecca here, the old family lore is this, get this. She loved having children around, but didn't care much for the men folks. So she had a lot of children out of wedlock. And so some of the records show that there are a few records that are bastardy bonds and such that name some of the sons of this. So I'm going to stop talking now and I'm going to let you dig in, because I know that you have gotten a hold of my Y-DNA results from this first cousin to me, first cousin once removed. And I want to see what you have to say about this little problem.
Excellent. Well, number one, I mean, you've attacked this problem in the correct fashion in that you turn to Y-DNA. That is 100% the best place to go when you are questioning paternity or you're just missing any male in your family tree. Y-DNA should 100% be part of your research because Y-DNA traces only that direct male line. So any DNA hits or matches that you get only trace to one line, as opposed to autosomal DNA. When you have a match, you could be sharing on who knows which line, right? So it's just so much simpler to focus your attention on one line when we use Y-DNA. So Excellent. This is absolutely the starting point of your research here, is to, number one, figure that out. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've just copied some things into Lucidchart to make it a little less formal than my usual PowerPoint. I like to use Lucidchart because I like to be able to move things around, and you'll see some of my charts later that we're going to use. But this is I'm just going to say your cousins, because that's easier than your first cousin once removed, whatever his actual relationship is to you. But these are his results from Family Tree DNA. So that's tip number one. If you want to get Y-DNA matches, you have to test at Family Tree DNA. They are the only company offering Y-DNA testing for matching. Okay, so there's no other choices, which is also, it's simple, it's nice, you have to test there. An additional point that people often ask is that if you transfer your DNA, your autosomal DNA, let's say you tested Ancestry, you want a Y-DNA test. A lot of people think you can just transfer your DNA from Ancestry into Family Tree DNA and have them test the Y. Totally doesn't work. You can only test the Y if you actually swab your cheek. That's how they take their DNA sample. So just a heads up, you will have to retest at Family Tree DNA if you want to do the Y-DNA test. Okay. So here we go. We've got your cousin's test results up here. And the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to move my little star around so you can see where I'm looking. So you've got two different views up here, a detail view and a table view. So this is a relatively new feature. And I always choose table view because it looks like the old view. So maybe I just like things like they were, but I always choose table view. So that's what we're looking at. The next thing I noticed is that your cousin has taken the 37 marker Y-DNA test. So along the top here are all these different levels of testing that you can take at Family Tree DNA. And you did the right thing. Testing at 37 markers is a great place to start. The price point is relatively low, and it's usually enough to tell you if you are or aren't related to other people in the database. And that's just the foundation. There's really no point in spending a whole bunch of money on a test if you don't match anyone, because then it was, it's still a record, but you did the right thing in testing at 37 markers. Okay. And we'll talk about when you might want to test more in a minute, but that's the first thing. Okay. The next thing that we look at usually is this column right here, which is your haplogroup. Okay. And a haplogroup is a deep ancestral group. It just represents this very broad geographic region where you're from. So when people are looking for a Native American ancestor, an African American ancestor, a lot of times a haplogroup can be a really good way to help you know you're on the right track, because there are very specific haplogroups for those groups of people. Now, in your case, you're looking for another probably European person to be the father of Gus. And so the haplogroup isn't going to be that helpful. So your haplogroup here, this RM269, is actually the most popular haplogroup in all of Europe. Of course. Aren't you excited to be like popular? So it's not really going to tell us all that much. Now, you'll notice this last person here has a different haplogroup than you. Theirs is this RBY3231 something. And all that really means is that this person has done some additional testing. So no need to worry. You're probably that haplogroup as well. It's like haplogroups also kind of have a family tree, and RM269 is like at the very top. He's like your 50th great grandfather or something. And then these other haplogroups kind of come down after him. So that's a whole, like in my Y-DNA course, we have an entire lesson on haplogroups, and there's tons you can learn. And it's fun to dive in and kind of learn more about these naming patterns, about how to do more testing, about what the more testing means. But for our purposes right now, we're just going to kind of say you're European. Okay. And that's it. Okay. Well, my cousin is, yeah. Your cousin. All right. So the next most important column is this one here called genetic distance. So in this genetic distance column, this is telling us how closely you're related to the other people who have tested. So you can see they're measuring this in steps. You're 1 step or 2 step or 3 steps difference. So that just means how different is your Y-DNA profile than their Y-DNA profile. That's it. And so the more closely you're related, the fewer steps you'll have. So I have some rules that I like to follow to help people know exactly who they should be paying attention to in this table. So my number 1 rule is that your genetic distance, this number, should be 3 or fewer if you ever hope to find a common ancestor with this person. Okay. So that's when you've tested at 37, where you've tested, or 67. If you've tested at 111 markers, I'll allow up to 5 differences. But that's really it. So if you see a bunch of people on your match list that are 6 or 7 differences from your profile and you're wondering who they are and how you're related, stop wondering. You're not going to figure it out, probably, because you're related way too far back, way before records, way before genealogies were even taken. So that's the simple explanation of this table. Of course, in my Y-DNA course, we go over every single thing on this table and really dive in deep, but those are the things that are the most important. And the truth is, if you don't have any good matches by Diahan standards, matches that have 3 or fewer differences from your profile, you're unique. And there's no one else in the database that's really even worth your time. So there's really nothing more you can do to move forward except for test more people and try to get yourself some of those matches.
Okay.
So, but when you first logged in, I'm sure what you noticed most was this name column where you saw that everybody has this same surname, which is a really big deal, right? It's also a really big deal because you only have 4 total matches. Now, this is kind of hard to determine because you don't like spend all day looking at everybody's Y-DNA results, but I've looked at a lot of Y-DNA results, and people who are in your haplogroup, the most popular haplogroup in Europe, usually have more 37 marker matches. They're not good matches. They're those 4, 5, 6, 7 marker differences matches. Some of them are even closer, but they have all different kinds of surnames, and it's kind of a mess. A lot of people in this haplogroup just have a lot of matches because their profiles are pretty common. They're just kind of typical Europeans. And so you kind of have to wade through your matches a little more. Your Y-DNA is sending a very clear and sharp and confident signal that you don't have that noise that a lot of people have. For example, my dad, also RM269, at 37 markers, he has over 300 matches.
Wow.
Okay. And like 5 of them share our surname. Okay. So it's not like we're related to these people. They're just European like we are. And my dad's profile is so common. Okay, so what this means is that your 37 marker Y-DNA profile has enough distinction from the rest of your haplogroup that it's doing a really good job identifying your line, which means we can have even more confidence in these matches that you see because there isn't a bunch of noise. So the fact that you have only 4 matches, they all have the same surname, gives me a lot of confidence that you did identify the correct biological surname for this line. It likely is Davis.
Beautiful.
Okay? So that's really exciting. Okay.
It always helps to have a second set of eyes on things and gives me some.
It does.
Confirmation.
Okay.
Yep.
Now we could just end this right here, which is kind of what you did. And we could go look at autosomal, and you found a lot of awesome things there. But I just want to demonstrate kind of the potential of what even just this small amount of data can do to help you figure out your relationship to these matches. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I teach in my course is how to identify what I call your generation of connection. How far back in your family tree do you need to go before you're going to connect with these guys? Okay, great. You're a Davis, but how? Like at what generation, at what ancestors, right? Do you share? So one of the things you can do is over here on the side, there's this little, looks like a graph kind of icon over here.
Yes.
Like analysis. I think that's what they're going for. So if you click on that, what it gives you is an estimate of your generation of connection. It tells you about how far back they expect you'll need to go before you share a common ancestor with each of these individual matches. Okay, so I've pulled those, they call them they're tip calculators. So I'm going to zoom in here on one. So this is the tip calculator for the match we're going to call BL. So your match BL, what it says is that at 4 generations back, they think it's about 84% likely that you'll find your common ancestor at or before 4 generations back.
Okay.
So that's pretty great. So I like to hang out right around that 85% mark. That's kind of where I consider to be our generation of connection. I work from there. Okay, so you can see as I pulled the generations of connection for each of your matches, with HA, you also have about at 4. This SR person, we're going to swoop all the way down here. And you can see this person's more distantly related. They've got this, 70 to 80%, but that's at 8 to 10 generations. SR with 2 steps is at 6 to 8 generations. And this WG with 3 steps is about 8 to 10 generations.
Okay.
So these tip calculators are really helpful. They help us decide when people are related. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to add these little labels in here so we can remember about how far back we're expecting to go to connect with each of these matches. So my little yellow boxes now mean number of generations.
Love it.
Okay. All right. So this is us over here. So now we have enough information to kind of try to reconstruct a pedigree. Like, how would we imagine that these lines would all come together? Because these ancestors that your matches have provided, I haven't looked into their pedigrees at all. Did you at all? Do you know how these lines connect?
A little bit.
A little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, yes, a little
but
bit.
it's complicated, right? And a lot of people have a lot of missing records, and Davis is a pretty common name. So
right.
It would take you a long time really to try to build these pedigrees probably for everybody, but we can kind of do it just by using these kinds of numbers. So if we're looking these guys again, here's our matches. Okay, so if we're connected with HA and BL at about 4 generations, then we can kind of just throw an ancestor in here. We're going to expand him out so that he covers us and them. We're going to say that he's about 4 generations back. And then we can just draw our lines and connect everybody back here. Okay, so this is a Davis common ancestor. We would expect that about 4-ish generations back, we would find this person. Now, Jeremiah, born in 1800, he's already going to be at that spot, right? He's going to be at least 4 generations back from us. He might be the common ancestor. He could be the ancestor of Henry and our ancestor as well. But this is just our hypothesis. Essentially, what it's telling us is that you and HA and BL should share a common ancestor with each other before you're going to share a common ancestor with this guy, because this guy is going to connect through a different Davis ancestor, somebody farther back. And again, we're going to guess based on our generation of connection that this one's maybe 7 generations back. So that's going to connect your line with this line. And then the last thing we need to do is connect this last ancestor back here, who's going to connect this William Davis line. And again, we're going to guess that he's going to be about 10 generations back or so. And we're going to connect everybody like this. And then just like that, we've built a pedigree for your family that helps you see about how far back we would expect these different breakpoints to happen. And it gives us a place to start. It gives us some boundaries on how far back that we should be going. It helps us, okay, well, I only need to find 2 more generations on this line, and then maybe we'll connect. And it just kind of gives you some help, essentially. Now, again, we could end this right here. This is good information to have, and it would help you as you try to reconstruct their pedigrees. But there's even more information because we have some mutations. Now, mutations can happen at any generation, and they can happen, usually the average mutation rate for Y-DNA is about 1 mutation every 4 or 5 generations.
Okay.
So looking at our chart here, it's not surprising that we see some steps, some mutations, because you guys are connected, 4, 7, 10 generations back. Okay. So what you want to do is try to figure out what the mutations are, and if you share mutations among different lines. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find all of these matches in the Davis Family Project. And you should definitely join the Davis Family Project since we know that you are. But I could only find our one guy who's a descendant of Aaron. So what I did is, this is the Davis family, and I'm going to search on this page for the ancestor name of your match. So Henry Aaron Davis is the name that your match gave as his ancestor. In these family projects, they don't list your name, so you can't look up your matches by their name. You can only look up your matches by their ancestor. So it can be kind of tricky, especially if your match doesn't list an ancestor. Okay.
Right.
But we were able to find him. This is him. And this is his data. So you can see all these numbers coming out. This is his Y-DNA profile. So I copied this information out of this spreadsheet and I pasted it into Excel. And then I copied your data and put it into Excel and I compared each of these numbers. And what I found is that you guys are mismatching on a marker we call CDY. Okay. So
Okay.
CDY is like, so I'm going to move us over here to my next little spreadsheet here. So CDY is what we would consider to be a fast moving marker. So remember I said average mutation rate, 4 to 6 generations. So CDY is going to be on the 4 end of that. Okay. So it moves fast. So it's a really good marker because it can tell the difference between lineages in a short period of time usually. So what this means is your CDY 3739 is different than HA's CDY, but I only have your data and his. So I don't know what BL looks like at CDY or SR or WG. So it makes this process a little bit harder, but if you have this data, and I show you how to do all of this in my course, that if you have this data, you can like add mutations to the tree and you kind of move things around and it gives you a lot better idea of how people are related. But let's just say that you're the one with the mutation. Okay. So we're going to pretend that we know that everyone else has a different, but the same as each other value at CDY. Okay. So you have a 39, they actually have a 38. So theirs is 3738, yours is 3739. Okay. One mutation. Okay, all that means is that you have to have this mutation. It has to happen somewhere between your common ancestor and you. So anywhere in these generations, there's a mutation, no problem. Okay. The interesting thing is that you and HA only have 1 mutation, but you and BL have 2 mutations. So unfortunately, we don't know if HA and BL, what their shared mutations are, but we're going to make a guess, and this is an educated guess based on data that I've seen, that you and HA actually have a shared mutation. So I'm going to say that you guys have a shared ancestor with each other before you have a shared ancestor. I'm going to put it right here, I guess. Before you share a common ancestor with BL. So essentially your common ancestor, this person I'm calling Davis common ancestor 0, he had a mutation and then he passed it down to both you and HA. Okay, so this is the kind of thing you really watch for because it helps us identify these branch points. Because if this is the case, if you do share a mutation with HA that BL and SR and WG don't have, then Davis common ancestor 0 exists. And you guys, you and HA share a much more recent common ancestor with each other than you do with the rest of the group.
Let me see if I can repeat that to you. So the mutation is giving us, if we're thinking about a tree with a trunk and big branches and then little twigs coming off of that, those mutations are happening at the split point from a branch to a twig, and therefore gives us a closer look at least one of these matches.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really powerful. He's
just making sure we all got that straight at home too.
Good job. Yeah. Okay. So this is the kind of thing that you could work with. And this is especially helpful when we're beyond the point of autosomal DNA. Okay. So you're still dealing well within the realm of autosomal DNA, which we'll see. You've got lots of autosomal DNA matches. That's where you need to be spending your time. They're going to give you a much better generation of connection than your Y-DNA. But if you're back 5, 6, 7 generations, you can't turn to autosomal DNA. It's not going to help you. So you have to do things like this with your Y-DNA to help you find those generations of connection. So,
and just for clarification for the folks at home, the autosomal DNA is not going to help us back those 6 or 8 generations because our DNA is split in half with every generation, whereas Y-DNA is 100% from male to male to male to male, right?
Absolutely.
So I just want to make sure everybody at home understood that.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. And that's really important. There are limits, right, to what DNA can tell us. And autosomal, really, I tell people, don't use autosomal DNA to find an ancestor unless it's your 3 times great or closer. Other than that, it's
good
just
rule of thumb.
hard. It's just too hard.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the end of my why DNA analysis. And really all of it is just to say, we could do more with this if we wanted to, or if we had to. But in your case, it's much better to use our time analyzing the autosomal DNA because you're looking for someone that's your 3 times great or closer. Do you want to introduce us to the autosomal DNA search that you did?
So this is a graph that I put together of all DNA cousins, no matter what company they were testing at. This is autosomal DNA now. And I realized that this is maybe a little difficult to read, but I put the generational differences over here, right? And to the different grandparents. But if we back up, I'm going to zoom back. So this is what I have suspected based on autosomal and the Y DNA as who the father is potentially of my great grandfather, Henry Gus. This is the guy that I plugged into this tree, right? Here's Joel Davis as a hypothesis. And one of these days, I'm going to get Ancestry to fix this, where we can put hypothesis right here, because I don't want people that are visiting my public tree to assume that is the gospel truth, because I'm still working on this, because I don't know which one of the brothers, there are 5 of them. I'll go back over here. Let me back up. I know this is hard to see, but there are 5 brothers. There is 2 brothers here. This is actually 2 different wives. Okay. So there's Micaiah, Jesse, Joel, and there's Joshua and Exum Davis. I'm going to highlight those in yellow. So those are the 5 brothers that one of them, in my estimation, has got to be the father. And how did I come to that conclusion? Because all of these DNA cousins, after I determined from that Y-DNA test that they all had the Davis surname, I went back to Ancestry in Family Tree, Family Finder, and all the different companies. And I pulled every DNA test taker that had Davis in this family, because after doing some general genealogy, I found that this family of Davises is actually Joel Davis Sr. up here, Joel Davis and Paniah Newby. They were in the right place. That whole family is in the right place at the right time. This is in Randolph County, North Carolina in the 1860s. So my great grandfather right here, Henry Gus Henley, was born in 1862, in January of 1862, which means he was conceived in 1861, right at the heart of the beginning of the Civil War. You know, taking all of that information and doing a bunch of research, I started outlining all of the autosomal DNA, mostly from Ancestry, and marking their centimorgans in here. I've removed their names for privacy reasons. And then what I did was I started creating what I called hot zones. Long story short, these in pink are the closest centimorgan matches to not only my test taker, the Y-DNA test taker, and he did an ancestry test for me. Here I am over here. We both descend from Henry, Gus Henley, but these guys have got the most centimorgans, and theoretically they're half third cousins, half third cousin once removed, half third cousin over here, because they have different mothers, right? His mother was Rebecca Henley, and the mother of, you know, the grandmother, I guess, and great grandmother is Lorena Davis. Both of these children, theoretically, of Joel Davis. So whether I have this outlined or not, again, this is a hypothesis. I'm still working on it. But if I do this right, unless there is pedigree collapse, and I'm going to let you define pedigree collapse for everybody at home.
It's complicated because a lot of people confuse terms like endogamy and pedigree collapse and multiple relationships. But in the way I define it, pedigree collapse is when you're looking at your tree, and instead of having like 8 great grandparents, you've only got 6 or something. There's a couple that occupies more than one spot on your family tree that collapses your tree onto itself.
So if any of these people had great grandparents or grandparents that were second cousins, let's say, then the centimorgan counts theoretically should be higher than expected. But based on what I'm seeing, and I have done a lot of research on this family, but I have not found any pedigree collapse in there. So if that's the case, then this looks like Joel Davis is the father of Henry Davis. The only problem with this whole scenario is he had moved to Iowa by the time he was conceived. So unless he came back to visit family, sign papers, sell property, I don't know, I haven't found any records yet, but unless he came back in 1861 to visit his family, that doesn't match. So one other little wrinkle in this is that these two guys, Joshua Davis and Exum Davis, are closer in age to Henry's mother. She would have been about 30 years old when Henry was conceived. And he would have been, I think he was 28 or 30, I can't remember. And then this guy was like 34. So these guys are closer. Plus, there are bastardy bonds. Now, getting back to doing, as you would say, do the genealogy, there are bastardy bonds for some of Henry's siblings, but not for him. There are bastardy bonds naming these guys as bondsmen, not as fathers, but we know from bastardy bonds that these are in Randolph County Courthouse. The bastardy bonds, a lot of times the fathers would not admit that they were the father, so they would say they were bondsmen. They were stepping up to help pay for the care of the child without admitting guilt. These guys both show up in about 3 different bastardy bonds, some of them sometimes together, sometimes separately, but not for Henry specifically. My, again, hypothesis is this was right at the time the Civil War was starting to break out. Maybe the courts were closed. I don't know. I do know the newspapers all shut down during that time. So, you know, it's a work in progress. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that subject.
I have lots of thoughts.
Okay,
So-
fire away.
So
Okay.
first I want to ask, so one of the ways that we decide how people fit into a tree is using a strategy I call ask the wife. So if you look at Joel Senior, what was his wife's name again?
Paniah Newby.
Paniah Newby. Do you see DNA connections to the Newby family?
Well, that's a good question. I would have to go look.
Okay. So that's your first homework assignment is to
Okay.
see if you see connections to the Newby family. Let's assume you do. And
Uh-huh.
that means that Joel Senior and Paniah,
Paniah. I think
are-
that's how you pronounce it.
are your ancestral couple. And we
Right.
are looking for one of their descendants to be involved in Henry's life. Okay. So that's number 1. Number 2 is let's ask a similar ask the wife question about Joel Jr.'s wife, Nancy Stanley. Like, do you see any Nancy Stanley relatives in your family tree? Right? Because it always takes 2 to tango. And as you mentioned, Joel Jr. is old. I mean,
He's older.
He's older compared to Rebecca, right?
Right.
And in fact, he's so old. Well, there's technically time. If he was born in 1815 and Gus was born in 1860, right? 1860.
So
Okay.
Rebecca's born in 1830.
Yeah.
Joel is born, whoops, wrong Joel. This guy, so they're
1815.
15 years apart.
Okay. So 1815 to 1862 means that he was what?
47.
47. Okay. So actually, there's plenty of time for Joel to have had another kid that we don't even know about. So Betsy is born 1844.
Right.
So
And then we go all the way down to
Right.
1859 for the last child. And then
Right.
Henry's.
So what we always want to just think about is like all of the possibilities, right? Because we want to make sure that we're not just trusting what we see in a pedigree chart, which we know isn't always the case. There aren't always records that identify all the births. So we want to just ask ourselves questions like, what if Joel and his future wife, when they're 16, 17 years old, get pregnant, she has a baby, and they give it up for adoption. And then they go on a couple of years later and they get married and they have all these kids and they have a family. Okay. I've seen this happen lots of times, actually. Okay.
Okay.
So then that child, let's say it's a boy, let's call him John. John is then technically 20 something by the time Gus is born. So John could technically be the father. This unknown child could be the father, right?
Right.
And the only way we figure that out is if Nancy Stanley's DNA is in your DNA. If you have a connection to her, you're a descendant of the couple. And we've got to make a provision for this extra person. Okay.
Okay.
If she's not there, then we don't have to worry about her. Then we're just a descendant of one of the children of Joel Sr. and this Panaya lady, and we can focus on their sons. Okay. So that's the first thing that we have to just get out of the way. Is Nancy involved in this or not? Okay. So let's assume she's not involved, which brings us back to kind of where you were. So I'm going to share my screen again. I've drawn out your chart as well. Of course, in Lucid Chart, because I have to be able to move things around, and you can do it in Excel. I actually really like Excel as well. All right. So here I've kind of redrawn your chart. Okay. And I've color coded the matches according to their ancestors. So all of Joel's descendants are in orange. Okay. Here's your cousin. Okay. And all the centimorgans that you see are in terms of him because he's the older generation. Your matches are still valuable, but we're going to work with him for right now. Okay. So we've got, remember, like you mentioned, we've got Joel, and then we've got Jesse, and we've got Exum. Okay. And you had another boy, but I didn't put him in here yet.
That's all right.
Okay. All right. So essentially when we're doing this, what I want to do is I want to look at the generation we're on and look for anybody that's on our generation that's tested. And there's nobody. Okay. So because he's older, right?
Gentleman, yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So that means everybody is at least once removed from us. All right. So if you're a descendant of one of the boys that's listed and has his family member tested, so that's Joel, Jesse, or Exum, then you're going to be sharing more DNA with that person's descendants than of everybody else's. So we're looking for anomalies, right? Which you kind of mentioned, right? So we've got RP, DG, and SA who all share, 165 to 154 centimorgans. So these people seem to be, giving that really strong signal. The problem is we have this person, and actually I wasn't able to find this person's centimorgans for your uncle, but I think with you, he was at like 8.
8 centimorgans. You're right. Yeah. That's right.
So it's 8 for you, but it's probably a little bit more for your cousin because you're a generation younger. But even at 8, this person is still a descendant of Joel.
Okay.
Okay. So now instead of this huge, strong signal, we've got 8 centimorgans up to 154, which means whatever relationship you have to Joel and his family has to fit within that centimorgan range, 8 to 154. Okay. So that's a big range.
Yeah, it is.
So yeah. And so if we ask ourselves, okay, well, if you were a descendant of Joel, so I put these little labels out here to the side. This is a system that I use in my DNA skills workshop to teach people how to label and figure out relationships like this. So if your cousin is a descendant of Joel, then descendants of Joel would be his second cousins, of course, half, as you mentioned, right, half second cousins. And now we're on the line that's once removed.
Okay.
Okay. So these people, this NM, and I've made him blue because he's like, we want to pay attention to him, but he's an orange. So these SA, DG, RP, and NM, okay, are all descendants of Joel on the same generation. We would expect them to be half second cousins once removed. Okay. So we go to the Shared Centimorgan Project, which tells us these kinds of things. It says, okay, here's the relationship. Here's the centimorgans people should share. So if we look at half second cousins once removed, we see the average amount of shared DNA is 66, but they have seen in the project people who don't share any DNA all the way up to 190 for half second cousins once removed. So we ask ourselves, is that where we're at? Are we between 0 and 190 with these matches? And yeah, we're between 8 and 154, which is between 0 and 190. So yeah, that makes sense. Okay. But what if Joel's not the dad? It's one of these other people. Then instead of being half second cousins, they would just be third cousins once removed, right?
Wouldn't they be half third cousins?
Nope, because they share both Joel Davis and Panaya Newton.
You're right.
Because we're bypassing Joel, right? And it's somebody else. It's one of his brothers. We don't know which one, but if it's one of his brothers, then with descendants of Joel, we're just plain old third cousins once removed. Okay. So now we look over here and we find our regular third cousins once removed. We see average amount of DNA shared is 48 centimorgans. Our range is 0 to 192. And we're still totally in range.
Yep.
Right. And this is the problem, right? And this is kind of what you, I think, already kind of come up against is how are you going to decide this? Right. And so we can look at the other children and just, unfortunately, other lines just don't have as many people tested as Joel. You've only got Jesse and Exum here. But again, we can do the same thing. So if we are a descendant of Exum, if he's the dad, then with this match, RLC 45, we should be half second cousins once removed. And again, that fits. And if we're not half second cousins once removed, we're third cousins once removed. And that also fits.
Yeah.
So the problem is we're trying to distinguish between two relationships that just have such similar centimorgan counts that it's going to be nearly impossible for us to really decide which brother it could have been with the data that we have. So,
so you think it's ever solvable?
Is it ever solvable?
Maybe with more DNA testers?
Right. I'd love to see, more descendants of everyone. What I really think that you should do is turn back to Y DNA. Why? Because we have this mutation and we might have this mutation. What you need is a Y DNA tester from this line. So if we're looking again at these boys, I don't know, did Joel have sons? We only have daughters represented here.
Joel Jr. had a son named Jesse.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a couple sons here.
So I'd love to see a Y DNA test from a descendant of Joel and maybe from a descendant of Exum. Let's just see how they fall out. If there are mutations, if there aren't mutations, because it could be that Y DNA might be able to tell us something. It's kind of a long shot. Y DNA is, it's pretty stable. And so it could just share exactly, and there could be no difference, but it has happened before in cases I've done with Y DNA where one guy, Exum, he has a mutated Y DNA from the rest of his family. And then everybody after him has that one mutation, and you can be really confident that that's Exum's descendant. So it's worth trying. I don't know that autosomal DNA with our current technology is going to lead us there. If possible, I think what would be the most helpful, we need somebody in this generation tested. And I don't know if that person exists. If there is someone, again, Joel was older, right? So again, you may have a better chance in Exum's line to have somebody who's on that same generation as your cousin, because then we're not trying to tell the difference between half second cousin and third cousin once removed. It's now the difference. Mm-hmm.
You're talking about getting somebody a Y DNA tested.
I'm talking autosomal now. Sorry, I swapped. Okay.
I do see someone on there that there is some DNA.
That's our best hope. Because then instead of half second cousins, these people now are going to be half first cousins. And that's a much different relationship. First, the difference in the relationship between a first cousin and a second cousin, even removed, is much bigger than the difference between a second cousin and a third cousin genetically.
Okay.
So if you could get anybody in this entire Davis family who's in your cousin's generation to test, that's the best way. That's going to be the strongest signal. Now, let's say you find that person in Exum's line, and then we say, oh, definitely not Exum. Then all that's going to say is not Exum. Still could be Jesse, still could be Joel, right?
Right.
So your best case scenario is you test someone and we can see, yes, it's Exum. If not, it's just going to be a negative against Exum, and then we're going to have to move on and try to find people in these other lines if they're around.
The process of elimination.
Yeah.
That was, wow, a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So, you know, just like as always, it's still a work in progress. So you have a course about all of this.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to sign up for that course, how do they do that?
Well, so all of our courses are offered at yourdnaguide.com/the academy. So
Okay.
it's yourdnaguide.com/the academy. And we have several courses that you can take. The ones that we really talked about today were your Y-DNA course. So that's comprehensive. It's 3 weeks long. All of our courses have a accompanying workbook that is a PDF, so you can print it out if you want, or you can just use it on your computer. But it's meant to give you the practice that you need. Because even just now watching us, you probably got excited and you're like, I want to try that. But then you'll get into your own stuff and you're like, I don't know how to do this for myself. Like, it's hard to translate even what you hear in class to something that you're seeing in your own results. And so what the courses are really meant to do is to give you the practice that you need. So we have classwork, we have homework, and then you have a research log. So we really help you learn everything. And then we teach you how to apply it to your own situation so that you can make progress in your own research. So we have a class for Y-DNA specifically, which again covers everything that we talked about, the foundations, the introductory material, all the way up to understanding family projects, how to reconstruct a family tree using your Y-DNA data, as well as the big Y test. So all of that is included in our Y-DNA course. Then for the autosomal part, we call our autosomal class our DNA skills workshop.
Okay.
And so that is like intense, like you have to be like all in for 6 weeks. And it's the same process though. You have a classwork, homework, workbook, and then your research log. We also have coaches. So you get an individual coach that's like there to help you and I guess direct your path. You also get a one-on-one meeting with that coach. All of our courses have discussion boards. So if you have questions, you can just type your question in and we'll answer it. So the DNA skills workshop is really meant to help you find a 3 times great grandparent or closer. And we teach you the full process from beginning to end, how to do it, how to dive in, how to answer your question just using your DNA results. And of course, lots of genealogy. So yeah, so those are our courses. We'll make sure and have that link there in the show notes for you.
Well, I'm looking forward to diving in myself and try and up my game. So I look forward to that. And thank you. So I will leave some links in the show notes as to how to get to your course platform.
Perfect.
Anything specific coming up that you want to talk about?
So we have both those courses are open right now. So in July 11th, we're starting the Y-DNA course, and August 16th starts the DNA skills workshop.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank you, Diane. I'm still swimming in all those details. I know I'll be watching this video again and again just to make sure I understand it all. Now, again, the links for Diane's workshops are in the description box below the video here on the YouTube channel. There are more videos on the screen for your binge watching pleasure. We'll see you in the next one.